After nearly 2 years, the Rafah crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip reopened this week for pedestrian travel, though large-scale transport of goods remains restricted. The European Union Border Assistance Mission is currently overseeing these efforts in coordination with both Israel and Egypt. Also this week, following a period of heated rhetoric and anticipation for a military strike, the United States and Iran held their first round of negotiations in Oman. While talks mark a shift towards diplomacy, both sides have offered diverging narratives regarding the lead-up to the meeting and the nature of the discussions themselves. In a completely different area of the world, President Herzog arrived in Australia on Monday, and the visit that was supposed to be a solidarity visit with the Jewish community following the disastrous Bondi Beach attack soon became extremely controversial. Hello everyone, this is Brief.IL by INSS, a weekly dive into the events shaping Israel's national security. My name is Ofir Dayan and I'm a researcher at the INSS focusing on antisemitism and delegitimization. And here with me in the studio is Reserve Major General Tamir Hayman, the Chief of IDF Military Intelligence until 2021, who today is the Executive Director of the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. This is Brief.IL, let's begin. So let's begin with what is perhaps the most important strategic development of the last week on the global stage. Iran and the United States holding direct talks in Oman, but the way to get there was not easy. It was supposed to be a multilateral meeting with other Arab states in Turkey. Then it turned on Iranian insistence to a bilateral meeting in Oman. And Iran also launched a drone towards the USS Lincoln, which the United States intercepted. What was Iran trying to achieve with all these provocations and changes before the negotiations even started?
And they wanted to ensure that it will be a productive meetings, bilateral meetings that raises their position to equal that of the U.S. representative and not enter to what seems to be a regional dialogue where their position as a regional disruptor may be on the agenda. So that's once. They wanted to be professional and productive. Secondly, Oman is very important to Iranian because the Oman, it's where it all began. The JCPOA, the previous Iran deal, started at the Oman talks. So they are considered by the Iranians our credible negotiator and partners. They trust them, so they wanted to stage the scene as it is like the former discussion.
And it was reported that Israel insisted that these negotiations will address not only the nuclear arsenal that Iran is currently developing, but also the ballistic missiles and financing and support for proxies all across the world, and specifically here in the Middle East. Why is it so important for Israel to insist on those issues? And do you think that it is as important to the United States to insist on those issues? Because we heard President Trump mentioning by name mostly the nuclear arsenal during these talks.
Practically, Oman is a part of limiting the dialogue into the nuclear aspect because by presenting the arena, by arranging the arena in Oman, they are practically referring to the previous Iran deal talks, which are restricted only for the nuclear aspect. Why is Israel insists on expanding the scope of the deal? First of all, because currently there's no nuclear project in Iran. So what the discussion is all about? Insisting on zero enrichment? Zero enrichment, that's the situation right now. So why are we relieving the sanctions? For what? For the fact that we have already, that is Israel and United States, we have already limited the problem of the project, or Iranian project. We need to expand the scope a little bit. Secondly, it is well known that the prospect of the probability of Iran conceding into something in the area of missile is very, very low. because this is a part of their deterrence and power projections to the region. If they will restrict the range of their missile, they will never be able to strike Israel, and Israel will maintain their capability of striking them. So in terms
and that's
of,
why it's so important for Israel.
Yeah, and it is important to limit your adversaries' capabilities and maintain your own. It's trivial. It's not that, and the Iranian knows that. So there's zero chance that they will, unless something dramatically happen. And for that reason, the Israeli formal position is against any kind of a deal, except for a deal that practically means the total surrender of the Iranian regime to dictatorships by the West. Any kind of a deal right now is a lifeline to the Iranian regime in an unprecedented situation where it cannot solve its own internal problem, where it created a trauma in the 8th of January in the mass massacre of what they've done in order to tackle the protests. So it is a waste of a historical opportunity to continue on the regional and economic pressure in order to topple this regime, which may solve Middle Eastern problem, not just the Israeli one. So Israel is pushing the United States into a position which will be very hard to meet by the Iranian regime, that might end up with strikes, but definitely will not end up with a new deal that will relieve sanctions.
So we discussed Israel's interests, and it seems like the Israeli and Iranian interests could never meet. They're too far apart. It seems also that the distance between the Iranian and the American interests are very far. Can you expand on that? And in these situations, do you even see an opportunity for a deal, or is it just for the sake of talking and, having some more time to rebuild themselves? Are they trying, playing for time, or is it really an opportunity to achieve a deal here?
Well, Israel is not conducting the negotiation. Israel is not part of the deal. It's America versus Iran. Second, yes, it is important. The time passes creates legitimacy for a future U.S. strike. That is, we have tried to explore the diplomatical vector, and we've failed. So that creates the international legitimacy Trump needs in order to conduct full, massive operation. And in that aspect, the distance between Iranians' position and the U.S. position is not that far away, because according to U.S. official statement and Trump's own declaration, he is focused on the Iranian nuclear project. Of course, you can find slight sentiments in one tweet that he refers to the regional
you can find anything you want in his tweets.
Exactly. But formally, when it comes to the basics, and if you really investigate into Kushner and Witkoff declaration, they are oriented by the President Trump to deal with the nuclear project. In that aspect, they are not far away, because of the fact that there is zero enrichment right now. They might get to a potential zone of agreement along the lines that Iranians will insist on their historical right to enrich uranium, but for the meanwhile, for the next 10 years, they will not enrich uranium. And
that's very similar to the sunset clause that we saw in the previous JCPOA agreement.
It's a reverse sunset clause. You start by zero enrichment, you will end up with enrichment. Okay, in the sunset clause, you start by enrichment and you start to escalate it, and that may be a kind of an honorable escape by the Iranians to avoid a potential strike, immediate strike. And that can be presented by President Trump as a deal that's better than the Obama deal, because there's no enrichment at all, zero enrichment on Iranian soil. And it's not that far, okay? That's not really a genuine, credible, long-term blocking of Iran from this nuclear path.
And I think that if you look at the history, Iran would probably, breach this agreement in certain ways that would allow for a certain response. But if we're speaking about people who, disagreed with the JCPOA, and probably would disagree with Kushner and Witkoff in their negotiation, is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who's flying to the United States tonight. We're recording on Monday, so he's flying tonight or tomorrow morning to the United States in an urgent trip. So from it was announced yesterday, and now he's flying. Why do you think this urgency? And what is he expected to insist with President Trump on? And what is the power balance between him and Witkoff and Kushner in terms of what they want and what Israel wants?
That urgent flight indicates to me that the discussions in Oman were leaning towards the favorable side. That means it's not failed negotiation, and there will be an ongoing discussions. And that may end up with Iran deal. And as said before, because of the fact that Iran is in an unprecedented situation, giving any kind of a deal right now will help the regime survive. And that's against the Israeli interest right now. It's a huge loss of historical opportunity.
But what can Israel do in this situation?
Presents its case of what are the red lines that U.S. should stick to. For example, before we are reaching the ballistic missiles, okay, let's talk about the nuclear project. Full control over all the aspects of nuclear potential threat, which is enrichment, weaponization, and a carrying vehicle, what's launching or missiles or whatever. Secondly, zero enrichment over Iranian soils indefinitely without sunset clause, because if it's a matter of historical perspective, Iranians are long-term thinkers, long-term strategy planners, and 10 years is just a blink of time. They will eventually resume, and Israel will not solve the problem. And secondly, regarding the problems of exporting terror. That terror eventually hit the United States president. That was behind the attempts of assassination of the U.S. president on U.S. soil. Iranians' global terror networks threatens not just Israel, threatens Europe, all of the Middle Eastern countries, and of course, U.S. And third, it is the missile manufacturing project. No country should possess that stockpile planned by the Iranians that can eliminate or strike in a very crippling manner Israel. And that is essential to Israel long-term security. And I think those are the 3 or 4 red lines that Prime Minister Netanyahu will try to convince President Trump.
And if these negotiations in Oman fail, what are the American options and Israeli options for a kinetic response to Iran?
Well, Israel demonstrated its capabilities, not all of the capabilities in the 12 days war. So I imagine our listeners know how to imagine how does Israel response look like, which is very efficient. But compared to the U.S. capability, it's nothing. U.S. is the only country in the world that its armed forces can be assigned of a regime change. I don't think that's in the scope of capabilities, not to Russia, not to China, not to any global power. The only military power that can practically remove leaders from their position and change the regime are the U.S.
And we saw a demo.
We saw a slight demo, very narrow, huge special operation. Something I think Putin is very jealous when he sees that, considering his failure in Ukraine.
Xi Jinping is also very jealous.
And Xi Jinping might consider doing that in Taiwan. But not, those are very, very slight special operations. And we are talking about a regime change operation. And I'm not sure that President Trump will issue that order. It's not really clear to me right now and to us what President Trump is planning. He's putting all the options on the table, and in that way he can maneuver from a deal to a strike. And we don't know what the planning mission for the U.S. armed forces, whether it is a regime change operation, a regime degrading operation, or operational elimination of capabilities in Iran. Those are three different missions that each one of them has a totally different meaning on how the footprint of the military might deployed.
So we mentioned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the United States, and the fact that he's arriving sooner than expected, he was supposed to be there next week, also leads us to the next topic of conversation. He's missing the first inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace that is scheduled for the middle of February, so he'll arrive before that. I'm sure he's not very sad to miss this occasion.
He's not losing sleep over the fact of the missed photo op with Erdogan.
And all those nice people from Qatar and other places. But he's missing that inaugural meeting, and it does mean something for Israel that is a member but would not be sitting at that table. But it also means that we might be moving towards the beginning of operationalization of the technocratic government in Gaza that hasn't been active so far. And when we talked about it, you mentioned that this technocratic government received some authorities that previously belonged to the IDF, to Israel. So if you can expand for our listeners about, these authorities and what do they mean for Israel's ability to control Gaza and ensure Israel's security and needs.
Yeah. First of all, where we are in the Twilight zone. Okay. The previous situation of warfare practically ended. Israel is deployed along the yellow line. There's no hostages in Gaza Strip and no reconstruction. Nothing happens except for frictions along the border, along the yellow line, which ends up with casualties, mostly terrorists of Hamas, but some Israeli soldiers are wounded also. That can not endure, okay? This twilight zone in between. What's next is the construction of this Gaza Technocratic Committee, Government of Gaza, the Board of Peace, and all of those, all of the organizations we have discussed before in previous episode of Brief.IL. The problem right now, or the next challenge, is for the Israeli government. The challenges are, first of all, the presence of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in the Rafah crossing, which was opened.
Right, and we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, and there is a presence of the Palestinian Authority stamping the passports of people entering and exiting the Gaza Strip. Secondly, most of the technocratic committees the professionals are somehow related to the PA or to Fatah, not that suitable. And third, the presence of Qatar and Turkey in the Board of Peace and in the executive board of Gaza. That's not comfortable for the current Israeli government. And then I think more or unprecedented something that we should look into that is the authority, the legislation authority of the next government in Gaza. For the first time, there will be a government in Gaza that has the authority to approve buildings, to approve projects, to approve entry and exit from Gaza. All of those authority used to be under the control of COGAT, the government, the coordination of government activities in the territories, IDF officer, under the authority of the government. It seems like we are facing a situation where there's a bubble of limited sovereignty of Israel over territories and projects in Gaza Strip that are fully controlled by the Board of Peace, by the international community, and the Technocratic Committee of Gaza.
And that's also above the yellow line?
Yes, of course. It is principally the Technocratic Committee will be stationed in the red zone, in the area controlled by Hamas. And eventually, according to the plan, to the Trump plan, it will expand its authorities to all Gaza Strip. Okay.
And what are the risks that are posed to Israel when the technocratic government can approve building and entry and exit of individuals and commodities from and to the Gaza Strip?
Part of it depends on your ideology. That's whoever dreams of reoccupying Gaza, annexing Gaza, and creating settlements in Gaza. That's a lost dream, and some of Israeli ministers in the more hawkish right side of the political map in Israel are still hoping for that. So that is off the scale, off the table indefinitely. Secondly, the leverage of reconstruction is one of the more fundamental tools remained in the Israel government hands in order to ensure Hamas demilitarization and disarmament of Hamas. If the reconstruction tool will be taken from the Israeli government and placed in the Board of Peace, placed in authority that's beyond Israeli ability to restrict it, we are losing a leverage that might end up and not ensuring that Hamas is demilitarized and demobilized.
And what can Israel do?
I think that will be also part of the discussions that Netanyahu will be holding in the White House. Israel needs to ensure a second veto authority to examine what are the projects planned, to see and evaluate how the money flows, and eventually give its own authority. I think that's what Netanyahu and that's what the Israeli government are trying to achieve right now.
And before we move to the Rafah crossing that you mentioned earlier, I'm just curious, do you think a friendly government like the United States that would be able to veto instead of Israel would be enough to ensure Israel's security or not?
Well, we tend to rely on ourselves, and we burned our fingers quite substantially in the previous rounds that we kind of stripped ourselves from the responsibility. So I imagine, although friendly government and although everybody with good intentions, Israel will be willing and probably will ensure the fact that their scrutiny over the procedures that connected to the reconstruction of Gaza, and more important, the most important issue is the demobilization and disarmament of Hamas. Because according to the plan by the Americans, they want to reconstruct all of Gaza, a strip by strip, a neighborhood by neighborhood. It's the only way it can be done without Hamas. And I think Hamas will do its best in order to prove that the international community and to the Technocratic Committee of Gaza that they are the only one that can provide law and order enforcement. And they will do that by exactly challenging them on the streets, challenge the law and order on the markets of Gaza. in order for eventually the international community and the technocratic committee asks Hamas to cooperate and be the force enforcement agency, which is contradict the current plan, which that according to that they should strip of their weapons,
Right.
all kinds of weapons, by the way.
Right. So we'll move to the Rafah crossing. And throughout this war, what we've been hearing is that the Rafah crossing is a central piece in Hamas's ability to rebuild itself, that this is the crossing and the Philadelphia corridor that is in the same area. This is where Hamas builds tunnels, and we even heard that he might send some of the hostages to other places through this, through the corridor. But the Rafah crossing has been opened as the first stage in the second phase of the Trump peace plan. Why now? What made it possible? Until now, Israel rejected and objected to the opening of the crossing. Why is it possible now? And if it's possible now, why not sooner?
It is open because it is a condition to go forward to the next step of the technocratic committee entering. They are now, this government of Gaza, still in Cairo, still planning, still training, whatever they are doing now in order to prepare themselves to enter Gaza. They will not enter Gaza unless the Rafah crossing is wide open to both sides, and that was...
And currently it's just for individuals, right? It's not for goods or commodities.
That's the second thing. According to our investigation and our after actions report, when we tried, that the Israeli intelligence tried to figure out from where that Hamas receives all its armament or its capabilities, it seems like it's not from the tunnels beneath Gaza. It's through the Rafah crossing. Most of the smuggling came through the Rafah crossing, embedded in whatever goes through trucks and merchants, etc., etc. So for time being, that is not approved. The only passage right now in Rafah crossing are for individuals, for pedestrians, who are scrutinized and checked security, and after passing through the PA authority approval, they are entering the green zone, the area controlled by Israel, and those pedestrians, before moving to the red zone, are being checked once again by Israel, and that is approved. So for time being, there's no huge security breach, potential breach in Rafah crossing, although it's open. I don't know what will be eventually develop from there, but that's the situation right now.
So you mentioned the entity that is checking the pedestrians in the crossing is not Israel. It's the European Union Border Assistance Mission, or EUBAM. What are the possible obstacles that Israel would have dealing with such an entity controlling? And Israeli soldiers, IDF soldiers, are looking from afar. They're not in the crossing. They can only look at the people entering Gaza once they're already in Gaza. So what challenges does it pose, and how can Israel overcome those challenges?
Right now, there is a second line of defense after Rafah crossing. There is the yellow line. Along the yellow line, which splits Gaza into two sections, the Hamas-controlled area and Israel-controlled area, there's another checkpost. And it is a physical scrutiny of people entering into Gaza. So for time being, that's really not just observing from a far position. It's really hands-on security checking done by Israeli enforcement agency. On the long term, if Israel withdrew according to the plan of the 20 plans, Israel will lose that kind of scrutiny. And if that's the case, we are fully dependent and on the trust we give to the European entity, and I do think that it's not really challenging when dealing with pedestrians, with dealing with individuals. If reconstruction starts and trucks will enter Gaza Strip from Egypt, that will be an opening, very, very disturbing potential breach of security that really can eventually lead to Hamas regaining some of its lost capabilities.
But we understand that Trump is interested in rebuilding Gaza. He speaks about it often. So we can assume that trucks entering Gaza is not in the distant future. It will happen relatively quickly in historical terms. What can Israel do when that moment comes?
Well, Israel is stuck in a very difficult situation. On the one hand, it does not want the reconstruction of Gaza to come from Egypt because of security. On the second hand, it does not want it come from Israel. That is, Israel will be the provider of the reconstruction. For the time being, Israel has already decided that the first neighborhood that will be reconstructed, what we call in the UAE neighborhood, 20,000 civilians will live there. The corridor or the logistics hub will be from Israel. Okay, so that will be a pilot that somehow we'll see if that can be duplicated.
Hopefully it will. Speaking, you mentioned problematic situations. Another problematic situation that we're facing currently is that President Herzog, the president of Israel, landed in Australia on Monday, which is today, but in Australia it was a few hours ago. He landed because he was invited by the Prime Minister of Australia as some sort of standing together in face of antisemitism after the Bondi Beach attack. But despite the fact that this was supposed to be a solidarity trip, it very quickly became controversial. First of all, President Herzog, it's no secret, it was published in the press, flew in a commercial plane because Israeli private planes are not able to fly over certain countries that restrict Israeli planes from flying over them. But then when he landed, certain anti-Israel groups requested the federal government to have him arrested. What challenges this war present to Israeli generals and Israeli politicians and even representatives that are not political, like the president, when interacting with foreign nations?
Yeah, I think all of the events surrounding President Herzog's visit really poses us a very, very gloomy picture, or faces us a mirror of how things looks. Australia is a safe haven for Jews, used to be a safe haven for Jews. That was the less political country in the world. I remember once, not long ago, a few years ago, I visited Sydney and I tried to explain from where I am. They didn't really knew about Israelis, about Palestinians. They didn't really care. They were very, very nice people who wanted to conduct their own daily life, having fun and making business, whatever. Israel was not a volatile element back then. Look how things have changed, flipped around. I think mainly because of the policy of the Australian government, which is very, very left-leaning and did not make the necessary actions needed in order to tackle the rise of antisemitism, ignore the fact that there are foreign malign actors that are working to increase the flame, to raise the trends against Israel. And look what happens. It is being delayed. The visit was delayed, negotiated, protest over what? Over a brutal attack. And I know you are researching the anti-Semitism, and I wanted to hear what's your comment, what's your reflection of that? How did we end up with such situation, which is absurd?
I'm mostly worried about two things when I think of President Herzog's visit to Australia. First of all, it's no surprise that members of parliament from the Green Party in Australia objected this visit, but now we also see members of parliament from the Labour Party saying that the president shouldn't visit Australia, which I think says a lot about how Israel interacted with Labour or Democratic, whichever country, throughout the years, and specifically in these 2 years. Israel had very good friends in the Labour Party in the UK and in Australia, and it's not so slowly turning against us. And I think it's a shame that Israel did not have stronger relationship with left-leaning party throughout the years. But I think what should worry us as Jews more than even that, which is very worrisome, is how these interactions with President Herzog, which, he is overall a very, has a calming personality, is in consensus in the world globally, how this could influence our ability to fight antisemitism. Because President Herzog arrives in Australia in a solidarity visit with the Jewish community after the Bondi Beach attack, in which many people were murdered, celebrating Hanukkah. And I think Israel should be interacting with those countries in order to assist them in fighting anti-Semitism, because that's what Israel has been doing for the past more than 70 years. And if Israeli leaders are not even able to visit those countries to work through anti-Semitism issues in those countries, I fear that, as you said, the Australian government will be left with its own policies without the Israeli input into the anti-Semitic issues in Australia, and that's very worrisome to me.
I think that, first of all, we labeling Israel as a right-leaning party affiliated globally, it's really a very problematical situation. And we should not be, Israel and Jews, and anti-Semitism should not be a political issue. It's a matter of joint interests of the whole liberal democratic world to protect the rights of minorities worldwide. And after suffering our known history, that's more crucial regarding Jews worldwide. And I think it's very it's a disaster. That's labeling and that's coupling with left-leaning or with right-wing parties. Secondly, I think generally speaking, the war had its effect, and the fact that the war, it's really a potential that was used by certain actors to promote their anti-Semitism's view and anti-Israelis' views, is a cynical way of harnessing the catastrophe that happened on October 7, and that's really something that we should somehow try to explain. And the fact that the war is still hovering over our reality, because all of the files are still hoping, is not helping to calm things down, because there is a certain threat globally that Israel will return back, and it's nothing over yet. And that's something that we should do somehow work better to close those files.
And prepare our allies in different countries for that possibility. And just to sum up this discussion and this podcast, I will say that I think, Tamir, that you're right, that it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel or anti-Zionist views. And I think this is why institutes like the INSS, who are able to research deeply this issue and make this distinction, and I must say, this is a project that I'm working on right now, and making, reviewing the definitions of anti-Semitism and trying to make that distinction so we can better understand what is happening. I think this is where social media influencers and journalists are not enough. We need think tanks and research institutes like the INSS to do this job. So thank you, Tamir, and we wish President Herzog a good trip. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, our listeners and our viewers. This was Brief.IL by INSS, and every week we'll bring to you the most pressing national security developments for Israel. Thank you for our amazing podcast team, Omer Vixelbaum, Shai Shachaf, and Ariel Nugrian, and I invite you to join us next week for Brief.IL.